Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am Danielle, aka Stitcherista here on YouTube, and today is going to be another diamond paint with me while I continue working on Treasure Studios art Cherry Blossom by Lizzie Falcon. And it will be a true crime story time, and we're basically going to just get right into it. Just to sum up, yesterday work was like kind of a shit show and not a great day. I'm glad today's Friday. Let's just say that. So let's just get right into it. Oh, but I will say this one thing though before I get into the story. I watched last night the 5th episode of American Horror Stories. So good. Oh my God. I'm so glad because I loved episode 1 and 2, hated 3 and 4, 5, fantastical. And there is a 6th episode because I'm behind. So I may try to watch that at some point this weekend. If not, then definitely Sunday night. Okay. So today's story is Massacre on Schoolhouse Lane. And what symbol are we doing? Hourglass symbol. So George Emil Banks was a man beset by demons, struggling with his mixed race identity, living a highly disorganized life that included several romantic entanglements and a small flock of children, most of them born out of wedlock. Okay. George was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, or Wilkes-Barre, on June 22nd, 1942. His father was a black man and his mother was white. George would suffer racial abuse from both sides of the divide throughout his childhood. This, as you can imagine, had a profound effect on him. He did poorly at school despite having a tested IQ of 121. Wow. Eventually, he dropped out of school and joined the Army in 1959. But George and military discipline proved to be a combustible mix. He was discharged within 2 years after an altercation with an officer, and just months later, he was arrested for his involvement in a gas station stick-up, during which a clerk was badly beaten. That earned George a 6 to 15-year stretch at the State Correctional Institution in Graterford. Never one to bend to authority, George escaped from a work detail in March of 1964. He didn't get very far. He was captured soon after, and because of that, he had 5 years tacked onto his sentence. And he would remain in prison until his parole in 1969. George had spent 7.5 years as an involuntary guest of the state, but the time behind bars seemed at least to have a positive effect on him, so that's good, right? He soon married a longtime acquaintance named Doris Jones, by whom he fathered 2 daughters over the next 2 years. In 1971, he landed a well-paid job at the State Bureau of Water Quality, where he would prove to be a diligent worker. You know, I think anyone has the capacity to change their life for the better. Yeah. In 1974, his employer supported an application to the governor for commutation of the rest of his sentence. Once this was granted, George was released from all parole obligations, and it appeared that his troubled past was finally behind him. But the positive changes in George's life were at best superficial, and they did not extend to his character, which, when you really think about it, that's what matters, right? What's your character? You know what I mean? He remained a perpetually angry man, always on edge, always one step away from a meltdown. Doris, his long-suffering wife, had learned over time to ignore his outbursts. What she wouldn't countenance was George's frequent dalliances with other women. Oy, dude, you can't keep it in your fucking pants? By 1976, she had had enough, leaving with her children in the middle of the night and moving to Ohio. A year later, George filed for divorce, citing desertion. Okay. Shortly after, he moved to the address that he would make infamous, 28 Schoolhouse Lane. Oh boy. It was from this point that George started living what can best be described as an alternate lifestyle. he began accumulating a harem of vulnerable young women, some of whom had been homeless before George took them in. The fuck? Regina Clemens, her sister Susan, Sharon Mazzillo, and Dorothy Lyons all moved into George's house and into his bed between 1976 and 1978. The only thing they had in common was that they were all white and at least 10 years younger than George. Dorothy brought her 8-year-old daughter Nancy with her, and the other girlfriends would soon begin adding to George's clan. Good night! Are you kidding? Regina gave birth to a daughter, Montezuma, in 1976. Sharon had a son, Kisamayu. What's with these names? On October 6th that same year. And Susan had 2 children by George. A son in 1978 and a daughter, Mauritania. The son's name was Buende, 2 years later. So rounding out the clan was Fora Rude Banks, born to George and Dorothy in 1981. That had to have been a very stressful situation, having all of those people and all of those children. It had to. But while George's clan was growing, his mental health was becoming dangerously unstable. At the center of this decline was his old bugbear, racial prejudice. In George's view, everyone he encountered was a racist, everyone an abuser. He was convinced that his predominantly white neighbors were ganging up on him. He complained to a coworker that his house had been firebombed and that his windows were frequently smashed. He said that his girlfriends and children were intimidated on the streets, that his children were spat on, and that he himself had been physically attacked and called derogatory names. We don't know for certain how much of this is true and how much was the product of George's paranoid mind. Suffice it to say that George, who was always quick to voice his grievances, never filed a single complaint with the police. Okay. In 1979, my God, this story is so long. In 1979, George was called into a supervisor's office at the Bureau of Water Quality and given an ultimatum: resign or be fired. Oh, George. The once reliable worker had become a liability, his on-the-job performance hardly worthy of being called work. But George would not be unemployed for long. Despite his criminal past, he somehow managed to land a job as a prison guard at the State Correctional Institute in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. I don't know if that's the proper job for someone like that, right? So George would probably not have been hired had his new employers had some insight into his unusual hobbies. Lord. George had by now begun to keep a journal extolling the virtues of men he admired, men like Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy, and the murderous cult leader Jim Jones. He had also taken out a subscription to Soldier of Fortune magazine and had started reading up on ultra-militant black revolutionaries like John Muhammad, Jesse Lee Cooks, and Manuel Moore. Even more disturbingly, he had begun spouting dogma about a coming race war and talking about the need to build up a cache of weapons. Oh, Lord. By the summer of 1982, George's colleagues at the prison were becoming increasingly concerned about him. George was clearly experiencing some kind of breakdown. He spoke incessantly about a looming race war and said that he had started training his children to defend themselves. At other times, he expressed suicidal thoughts, saying that he felt like going up into one of the watchtowers and blowing his brains out. When word of these rants reached the prison authorities, they called George in and told him that he was being placed on extended sick leave and would have to attend mandatory psychiatric counseling. And this was only meant to help him, obviously, but it served only to accelerate George's growing paranoia. George was now more convinced than ever that the world was against him, and to make matters worse, he was currently involved in a custody dispute with one of his girlfriends, Sharon. Sharon had eventually grown tired of the cult-like atmosphere at 28 Schoolhouse Lane and had moved out, taking her son with her. So George responded by filing for custody, and since Sharon had no means of financial support, George won. Oh, God. The ruling was handed down on September 24th, 2002. However, Sharon defied the court order and refused to hand the son over. Her refusal sent George into a tailspin. He spent the night ranting and raving, feeding his rage with prescription antidepressants, washed down with copious amounts of gin. Not a good combination. Eventually, he passed out, and by the time he woke the next morning, his drink and drug-addled brain had come to a decision. The world was done pushing George around, and it was time to push back. Oh, boy. In the early morning hours of September 25th, 2002, shots rang out inside George's residence at 28 Schoolhouse Lane. The first to die was 29-year-old Regina, shot through the cheek as she dozed in a chair in the master bedroom. Dorothy and Susan, also in the room, were startled awake by the gunshots, but they could do nothing as George leveled his AR-15 at them. This semi-automatic rifle is the civilian version of the M4 carbine used by the U.S. military. It is devastating at close range. Yeah. A hail of bullets raked across Susan's chest, one of them killing her 20-month-old daughter, who she was holding. Oh, my God. Then George turned the rifle on Dorothy, firing 2 shots, which struck her in the neck and chest, killing her instantly. Finally, he turned the gun on his 4-year-old son, who was cowering on the floor. I fucking can't with that. Single bullet smashed into the boy's face, obliterating his features. How do you do that? How do you do that? You're psychotic. I mean, obviously. But George was only just getting started. Heading upstairs, he found 6-year-old Montezuma sitting up in bed, the covers clasped to her chest in terror, so 2 bullets fired at point-blank range ended her life. Then George headed down the hall and entered the bedroom of 11-year-old Nancy, the daughter of Dorothy. Remember, that's not his daughter. That she brought her with her when she came there to live with George. Nancy saw him step into the room and pushed her 1-year-old half-brother behind her, trying to protect him. It was an incredibly brave but tragically futile act because he killed both the kids and they died right on the spot. I just don't know. He's going to just... I don't know how you do that. So George had now killed every living being in the house, adult and child alike, but still his bloodlust wasn't sated, still his rage burned bright. So heading downstairs, he set the gun aside for a moment and donned military fatigues and a t-shirt that read, "Kill 'em all and let God sort out the difference." Oy. Then he slotted a fresh clip into the AR-15, grabbed a few extra boxes of ammo, and headed outside. Oh my God. Across the street, neighbors Jimmy Olsen and Ray Hall Jr. had heard the shots and come out to investigate. Spotting the men, George unleashed a hail of bullets, hitting them both. Jimmy and Ray collapsed to the sidewalk, and George stepped over them on his way to his car. So Jimmy would survive, but 24-year-old Ray died later that night at the hospital. Wow. By now, police units had been alerted by several reports of gunfire and were racing to the scene, but George had a head start. He was driving towards the Heather Highlands trailer court 4 miles away in Plains Township. His former girlfriend Sharon was living there, sharing a mobile home with her mother, her brothers, and her young son. Sharon was confronted at the door and backed into the trailer where she was shot through the heart. Then George walked over to the couch where his son was hiding under a blanket. He was also executed, 5 years old, by a bullet to the head. Also in the house at that time was Sharon's mother, Alice, her brothers, 10-year-old Angelo and 13-year-old Keith, and her nephew, 7-year-old Scott. Alice and Scott were mercilessly gunned down, and the other 2 boys had the sense to hide in a closet, and luckily George did not find them, so at least they survived. But with an APB now out for his arrest and every cop in the county hunting him, George was on the move again. Wow. Aware that the police would be searching for his vehicle, he abandoned it and carjacked a passing motorist. He drove this vehicle to an isolated area where he got out and climbed a grassy bank. Exhausted by his exertions, he lay down and promptly fell asleep, waking several hours later. He then drove to his mother's house, which astonishingly the police had not yet placed under surveillance, which is surprising. Mary Banks yet listened with growing distress as her son described the massacre of his family of her grandchildren. But Mary had heard her son's rantings before, and she refused to believe that he had done the things he was claiming. A phone call to the Schoolhouse Lane property soon set the matter straight. The call was answered by a policeman who wanted to know where George was, and at George's insistence, Mary hung up. With his location now known to the police, George left his mother's house in a hurry. After driving around for a while, he found a vacant house and broke in. Unfortunately for George, a neighbor spotted him and called 911. In no time at all, George had what looked like the entire police force parked out front, and still he wouldn't come out. He challenged the police to come in and get him, saying that he wanted to die, and he would remain inside the house for 4 hours, eventually surrendering after the intervention of a friend and former colleague, Robert Branson. 13 people had died during George's deadly rampage, 7 of them children. Charged with murder, attempted murder, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and car theft, George must have expected little mercy from the courts, but he got none at all. Found guilty on all counts, he was sentenced to death, although he was later declared mentally unfit for execution. He currently resides at State Correctional Institution Phoenix, a supermax prison in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and one of his fellow inmates was the former comedian, now convicted sex offender Bill Cosby. But Bill Cosby's out of prison, right? Can you imagine being in prison with Bill Cosby? Wow. I had not heard of that story. You know, there's so many of these that I haven't heard of. That's awful. All of those people, and especially the children, just died senselessly. And was it worth it? Obviously not. I mean, obviously this man was very, very disturbed. I mean, you don't gun down 13 people just because. It's a shame. It's a shame that it looked like he had turned his life around. That's sad. The whole story is just sad. Okay. We always end on a positive affirmation, and Jesus, we surely need that today. And I know I say that every day, but it applies every single day. So, A Year of Positive Thinking by Cindy Spiegel. Today is Friday, August 13th. It is Friday the 13th. Yeah. I'm like, oh boy. So, this one is titled, Release What You No Longer Need. Surrender the parts of your past that no longer serve you. People, possessions, thoughts. Be willing to release them if you don't need them anymore. Doing so creates the space you need to allow in true love, to create honest connection, and to live an extraordinarily fulfilled life. Yeah, and as you grow, as we get older, I think those things that you need to let go, it can change. And a lot of people are rigid, right? Especially as you get older, you get set in your ways. But I like to feel like I'm fluid because you never know what's coming. And so I think you have to be malleable. You have to be adaptable too, because as everyone gets older, I mean, things change so much from when you're a kid to when you're like now in your to where I'm now in my 40s. Yeah, you have to be fluid and let go of things that don't serve you and not feel bad about it. And one thing, I mean, this is kind of minor, but Bill hasn't been fishing in like 3 months. And he said, I do get tired of it. He's shown an interest in hunting. So I said, everyone puts you in a box, right? Like everyone has put Bill in the box of being a fisherman, but I said, it's okay if you don't want to do it anymore. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay. You don't have to justify your action to anybody or reason to anybody. I'm tired of doing it. I don't want to do it anymore. That suffices. And I think it was like, he felt better after I kind of said that to him. Like you don't need permission to not like something that you've liked for your whole life. You can change your mind. So I hope you guys all have a fantastic weekend. I will not be back with another true crime story until Monday. Tomorrow will be my cross stitch vlog, and then I'll take Sunday off from recording. So have a great weekend. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you so much for watching and subscribing, and I will see you in my next video. Bye, guys.